Good evening. There are very strong indications in China tonight that the political power struggle within the Chinese government has been resolved and that the political hardliners have won. After days of intense maneuvering, the 84-year-old leader Deng Xiaoping and Premier Peng are the winners. The loser is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, who has been so opposed to cracking down on the students who had tried to put together a moderate coalition. Now the more militant men in charge of the party must meet the challenge in the streets. We begin with the political purge. Here's ABC's Todd Carroll in Beijing.
Zhao Ziyang was last seen in public almost a week ago, near tears, pleading with hunger strikers to end their protests. Now, Chinese sources tell ABC News a special meeting of the Communist Party Politburo, which ended a few hours ago, has decided to strip Zhao of his power. He and other moderates favoring more liberalization here will be charged with forming an anti-party clique. The others expected to be purged include the defense minister, Qin Ji-wei, who is believed to have opposed the imposition of martial law in the capital, propaganda chief Hu Qili, who apparently allowed the Chinese press too much freedom in reporting the protests, and Vice Premier Tian Jiyun, who has helped implement Zhao's liberal economic policies. Sources say the shakeup was approved after a meeting of China's inner circle, led by the country's top leader, 84-year-old Deng Xiaoping, and his old military comrade, President Yang Shangqun, who last week complained publicly that protesters embarrassed him during the Gorbachev visit. A purge would mean more real power for Premier Peng, the orthodox communist conservative and chief target of the demonstrators. To enforce the power shift, the sources say, a military occupation of Beijing may be imminent. Troops who were surrounded and sometimes befriended by crowds of ordinary people in recent days are no longer considered reliable. They may be replaced by soldiers from across China, now massed in isolated military camps. The Army's chief concern is to prevent any rebellion within its ranks. An announcement of the purge in the Chinese leadership is expected within days. Todd Carroll, ABC News, Beijing.
What sources close to the Chinese leadership have been telling Todd Carroll about the power struggle is not yet known to the Chinese people. But as ABC's John Lawrence reports from Beijing, there were other obvious signs today that Peng was in charge.
All evening on Chinese radio and television, the lead story was an account of Peng's talk to 3 foreign ambassadors. It was a carefully revised account of his remarks, and they were notable for their sense of confidence and moderation. He played down earlier statements that Beijing was in chaos and emphasized the stability of the government. He pledged to continue China's policy of economic reform and opening to the outside world. He said the students and others who took part in demonstrations have good intentions. Many of their views are identical with those of the government. Peng appealed to other countries not to resort to interference in any manner. China's affairs, he said, are very complicated. A top deputy of Peng's was seen on television praising army members for the sacrifices they've made since coming to the capital and urging them to impose martial law successfully. The army units that entered Beijing a week ago are still camped on the outskirts, watched by students and civilians in case they make a move. Thousands of civilians remain at roadblocks and barricades around Beijing, waiting for any signs of military movement. About 30,000 people marched around Tiananmen Square Thursday, the smallest number since the occupation began 13 days ago. Journalists from the People's Daily, the party newspaper, were in the vanguard. Most of the students staging the sit-in now appear to be from outside Beijing. They are also the most radical.
The Prime Minister, Mr. Peng, is a big scoundrel.
The student movement is seriously split among factions who want to escalate the protests, those who want only to carry on the sit-in, and others who want to call it off. There is a bus parked in the square outside the Great Hall of the People, and it is occupied by students from the Academy of Dramatic Arts. A week ago, they were refusing to eat or drink. They have recovered now and resumed the vigil, waiting with everyone else here for the government and the army to make the next move. John Lawrence, ABC News, Beijing.
And a footnote to that, the latest radio newscasts in China report that Premier Li Peng has urged the troops in Beijing to be firm in their struggle against the small group of conspirators, as he puts it. Now, politics in the Soviet Union. The new Soviet parliament convened in Moscow today, the first Soviet parliament in which some members were actually chosen in real more than one candidate elections. There was an altogether new level of debate and some difficulty dealing with the new level of democracy. ABC's Rick Inderfirth is in Moscow.
What would Lenin have thought? No sooner had the new parliament opened than a deputy seized the podium, asking for a moment of silence for those killed by Soviet soldiers during a recent nationalist demonstration in Georgia. Then it was Mikhail Gorbachev's turn to take the stage, and his first act was highly symbolic, recognizing Andrei Sakharov, the once banned human rights activist, to speak. Sakharov asked that the first order of business be a report from the Soviet leader on his accomplishments and failures. That proposal was defeated, but the vote reveals something about the new parliament. There is an independent bloc of about 400 members willing to go against the party regulars. There were other signs of change. One deputy grilling Gorbachev on when he was informed about the use of troops in Georgia. Another demanding a modern electronic voting system to replace the old-fashioned method of holding up cards, which was just fine for the past rubber-stamped Soviet parliaments. Throughout, Gorbachev was the maestro, calling on speakers, asking others to wait, ignoring some proposals, counting votes. When there was grumbling among the deputies, the Soviet leader instructed them, "Don't get excited, I know what to do." Gorbachev was, of course, elected the new Soviet president, but not before two other names were placed in nomination, including that of Boris Yeltsin, the independent and very popular Moscow politician. The vote for Gorbachev was overwhelming. But just as important was the convening of the new parliament, an event that many Soviets hope will mark the point of no return for the democratic reforms now taking place in the Soviet Union. Rick Inderfirth, ABC News, Moscow.
And a footnote to this story as well. An article in the newspaper Pravda today sought to reassure the Soviet public that times have really changed, that most of the 2,250 deputies to the party Congress are traveling to and from Parliament by bus, not by limousine. Incidentally, perhaps you'll join us tonight at 10 o'clock, 9 Central Time, for a special on the tremendous changes in the Communist bloc and what challenge they present to the U.S. We call the program Beyond the Cold War. In a moment, the big political story in Washington, the maneuvering to ease Speaker Jim Wright out of office. And later in the broadcast, the dual tragedy of